Right, we are commencing recording, and today I want to get into the Platyzoa. I've said my piece about the lophophorates, the protostomes that have the lophophore, that tentacled feeding organ. So today I want to get a start on the second of those four divisions of the protostomes, for flat. So Platyzoa are the small. Now there are some scopic or teeth of some sort, but many of them do. They'll have some kind of jaw apparatus. The gut is complete, but usually the coelom is either reduced or there isn't one at all. And the single largest phylum in here is the Platyhelminthes. That's the flatworms. That second group below, the Gnathifera, includes a couple of phyla you're not likely to have heard of. One called the Rotifera. The rotifers is actually quite diverse and extremely common in freshwater. You should see some next week when we start using the microscopes again. The Acanthocephala is a parasitic phylum. It rarely parasitizes humans, although there are some cases of it. But it's the kind of thing you might conceivably see if any of you are thinking about vet school, if you're thinking about becoming a veterinarian. Anyway, there's others, the Gastrotricha and Cycleophora, you're perhaps less likely to have heard of, but they're part of this Platyzoan superphylum as well. So we'll start with the Platyhelminthes. They're acoelomate, which means the body is solid except for the gut. There's no fluid-filled cavity that the gut is suspended in. It's solid cells between the gut and the body wall. That creates some problems with diffusion of nutrients and gases. All right, if you've got a thick body where cells are buried deeply away from, any source of oxygen or place to diffuse carbon dioxide or what have you, you run into problems there. And as a consequence, Platyhelminthes that are large tend to become extremely thin. Hence the name Platyhelminthes, flat worms, literally. Helminth means worm in Greek. The gut only has one opening. The way out's the way in. At least some stages of the life cycle, there's ciliated epidermis. In the parasitic members of this phylum, in the adult stage, that ciliated epidermis is actually lost, and we'll talk about that when we come to it. But at least part of the life cycle, you have ciliated epidermal cells that may do a fair amount of the work of getting the animal around. Platyhelminthes are usually hermaphroditic. They're not necessarily simultaneous hermaphrodites, or in some cases, I need to remember to include this on the playlist, but there's at least one species where when two of them meet, they end up dueling to decide who's going to provide the eggs and who's going to provide the sperm. If I forget to do this, everyone should look up something called penis fencing on YouTube. It's really cool. Two flatworms fencing with a pair of dagger-like penises. Yeah, don't miss this. Anyway, I digress. There may be a few that do that have planktonic larvae, like what we saw for the echinoderms. Usually there's copulation. Fertilization is internal. Males may have rather complicated copulatory organs. A fair number practice what's known as traumatic insemination, which means the male stabs the female. Instead of inserting his organ into a purpose-made receptacle, he just skewers her. Yeah, be glad you're not a flatworm. Development is often, the eggs are often pretty yolky. You don't really get the equivalent of the kind of, free-swimming, feeding larvae that you saw in echinoderms, except in a few marine forms will have one. Stem cells are present throughout life. That makes quite a lot of regeneration possible. We won't be able to do it here, but flatworms of a type called planaria worms are noted for their abilities to regenerate. It's the kind of thing that I've seen in science fair projects. You can take a flatworm and split its head, and the thing will grow 2 heads. Or you can cut it into pieces, and each piece can regenerate a new flatworm, at least to an extent. There's a limit to how small the pieces can be, but flatworms are crazy good at regenerating themselves. In the parasitic ones, the presence of stem cells means that you have quite a lot of asexual reproduction going on, and we'll talk about that when we come to it. The traditional way we used to classify these guys was in 4 groups. Turbellaria. Turbellaria is actually related to words like turbulence. Turba is Latin for a crowd, especially a milling around, rapidly moving crowd. A mob would be a turba. And, turbulent would be stirred up like an angry crowd that's been disturbed. There's that word again. And turbellaria are called that because many of them locomote using primarily cilia. And if you watch one crawl over mud or something like that, the cilia tend to kick up tiny particles. So turbellarians, if they're crawling over mud, may actually leave a bit of a rooster tail, a trail of fine particles that they've kicked up. Most turbellarians are free living. There are some that are specialized for a parasitic lifestyle, most of which we aren't really going to cover in here. There are some parasitic turbellarians. And then we used to classify the rest of the platyhelminthes into a small group of ectoparasites that's mostly parasitic in fish, called monogenia. A large group of internal parasites known as the flukes, which belong to the trematoda, and then tapeworms and a few allied critters in the cestoda. That's the old way we did it. What we now recognize is that turbellaria is, as we say, paraphyletic. The last common ancestor of all of the critters that we used to call turbellaria was also a common ancestor of all of the parasitic taxa as well. And grouping the non-parasitic turbellaria into one group excludes some descendants of that last common ancestor. The word still gets used as an informal designation for free-living flatworms, but it's no longer used as a formal class. And exactly how to classify these, I'm not really going to go into in detail. Informally, people can talk about larger versus smaller, macroturbellarians versus microturbellarians. And again, that's an informal designation. It's not formal taxonomy. How the formal taxonomy goes, I'm not really going to worry about here for the purposes of this class. And then most of the parasitic groups belong in a single clade, noted for the common trait of hatching with a ciliated epidermis and then shucking that and replacing it with a new type of epidermis that's very distinctive. I'll show you details of that coming up in a bit. But that clade is called the neodermata, the ones with new skin. Neo for new and dermo for skin. And so a cladistic analysis would look sort of like this. You have all of the Turbellaria forming a variety of groups. One lineage leads to the neodermata. That's the flukes and tapeworms and monogeneans. And the last common ancestor of all of the Turbellaria was also a neodermatan ancestor. So you can't classify all of the Turbellaria together without excluding some descendants of that common ancestor. It still is handy to talk about them that way, but it's not a formal rank. So what makes free-living flatworms? The epidermis is ciliated. Small turbellarians can pretty much just glide on their cilia. If you see one on a microscope slide, you'll see it just kind of ooze over the slide, and you can't really tell just by looking how it's doing it. Macroturbellarians will also have cilia, but they're likelier to assist their cilia with muscle movements. I am suddenly drawing a blank on exactly what the physics of this are, but ciliary transport gets less efficient the bigger you get. So macroturbellarians often try to assist their ciliary locomotion with muscle contractions. There's even a few that can swim. These are large marine turbellarians in a group called the polyclads that can swim by flapping the entire body. I will try to remember to post a video of this. There's one that's affectionately known as the Spanish dancer because it's very flat, it's roughly, and when it swims by flapping its body, it looks like a Spanish flamenco dancer swishing her skirts around as they do. The epidermis has lots of glands. These guys can secrete mucus. Some can secrete kind of glue. There are rod-shaped structures in the epidermis called rhabdites. And then between the body wall and the gut, there is solid tissue called parenchyma. You might have encountered that word before. Parenchyma gets used for just kind of loose filler tissue. In plants, parenchyma is the softest type of plant tissue. So I don't know if you remember this, if you've had botany, but much of an apple or a berry would be made of parenchyma tissue. And then firmer types are collenchyma and sclerenchyma, if you remember that. If you don't, no big deal. Parenchyma just means kind of filler. The muscles are relatively complex, and here's one. This is a small turbellarian that's been stained, getting the muscles to fluoresce. And you can see the head is at the right. That ES at the right stands for eye spot. The tail is at the left. You can see longitudinal muscles running from head to tail. You can see circular muscles running perpendicular to those. And then diagonal muscles wrap around the body in spirals. And here they're those diagonal stripes that you see making the pattern of what look like X's. We've talked about how circular and longitudinal muscles work. Even though flatworms don't have a big fluid-filled space, right, because they're not coelomates, if you think about it, every cell is a small fluid-filled space. And so even if the flatworm doesn't have a coelom proper, you can say that it's made up of, many thousands of little hydrostatic skeletons. And some of the rules that we talk about having to maintain constant volume because water is not compressible, those would apply to flatworms as well. So you can have flatworms where the longitudinal and the circular muscles work against each other. As we talked about, diagonal muscles tend to do things like prohibit kinking, for example. The nervous system's relatively large, and the basic idea is you have a pair of nerve cords um, with regular connections, like the rungs of a ladder. The rungs are called commissures. On the right, that's the nervous system of a planaria type flatworm. I'm assuming you saw planarians back in 1440 or 41 because Carafit orders them most of the time. On the left, that's the nervous system of one of these big, flappy marine flatworms called a polyclad. I'll show you pictures of those a little bit later on. And in both cases, you can see there's a fair amount of branching. There's a fairly good-sized nerve center up in the head, a brain. And you can see the cross connections between that pair of nerve cords, the rungs of the ladder. Those are the commissures. Right. Fertilization's internal. Eggs are usually relatively large and yolky. There are some that will hatch into planktonic larvae, but very often development is direct, which means the eggs just hatch into miniatures of the adult. There's no planktonic larval stage. They're almost all hermaphroditic, but not always simultaneously. There are some in which the male organs develop first, and then female parts develop later, and that's said to be protandric. Proto is first, as in protostome, and andros is Greek for a male. And there's others where the female parts develop first and the male organs come in later, and those are said to be progynic. Gyne is Greek for woman, as in, gynecology and all that. Penises may be fairly complicated affairs. In many species, the partner that's receiving the sperm gets them injected right into the parenchyma, and the sperm kind of find their way to the ovaries and fertilize the eggs from there. So that, for example, this just happens to be a microscopic flatworm. The penis right here is shown retracted, but you can see this thing that looks kind of like a needle, or maybe a pair of them, pretty much dead center of that picture. That's a piercing penis stylet that it will use to inseminate another flatworm. This one, I can't seem to find these consistently, but one year there was a humongous population of them in one of the drainage ditches along College, right next to University Place apartments, which I think back in the day were still privately owned, and they kept busting meth labs in them. I don't know if it's still like that. But the ditch outside had a big population of these, and I have not been lucky enough to find them every year since then. But this is one you could see around here. This is called stenostomum, and it reproduces asexually. There's a fair number of flatworms that can do that. Planaria worms can reproduce if you just cut one, but catenulids do this all the time. In fact, catenula is Latin for little chain, because you'll always see 2 or 3 individuals stuck together like this, and by the time they separate, each one is going to start dividing again. So you don't usually see individual worms. You almost always see them in 2s or 3s, and they will periodically break up as as the life cycle goes on. So they reproduce asexually, but they also reproduce sexually, And that's an example of protandry, in that when they reproduce sexually, males appear first. Males impregnate females by injection, by traumatic insemination, as it's called, and there's no way for the eggs to get out, so the hatching eggs just burst out and kill the females. This sounds very unpleasant, and if it sounds like it's really good for the males, bear in mind that the males will develop female organs later and get impregnated and burst in their turn, right? So everybody starts out as male, ends up as female, and then ends by exploding so the kids can come out. So, yeah, right. Pretty horrifying there, but that's an example of protandry. You'll see that in other fields as well. A lot of fish, for example, are protandric. Many other flatworms do lay eggs. That's a planarian egg in a resistant capsule. And then this is the one you need to look for on YouTube. This is a pair of Hawaiian free-living marine flatworms. The upper surface is this beautiful black and gold and cream color scheme. And when two of these Pseudobicerus hancocanus meet, they both rear up, and each extends a pair of dagger-like penises. You can see one of them, the individual at the left, you can see one of his penises is out. There's actually another one that you can't see because it's covered up by the partner on the right. They look a little bit like the bra that Madonna used to wear back in the 80s, if anybody has seen that. And they'll both rear up, both will extend their pair of penises and spend up to an hour each trying to stab the other with them. And eventually the winner injects sperm into the body of the loser. The loser's eggs get fertilized that way. Here you can see some sperm on the surface of the loser at the right, and I think those will just kind of burrow their way through the epidermis into the body of the loser. I shouldn't really call it winner and loser, but you can think of it that way because eggs are, by definition, bigger than sperm. That's what makes an egg cell, and they're more energetically expensive to make, especially if they contain something like yolk. Meaning that if you want to reproduce, it can be advantageous to be the male because it takes much less energy to produce your gametes. So the winner gets to reproduce without having to expend the energy on making eggs. The loser has to make eggs, but the loser is getting sperm from a partner that has proved very vigorous. So the loser is getting presumably high-quality sperm to fertilize the eggs. The winner is getting to reproduce without spending the metabolic energy on making eggs. So, flatworms are weird, man. Right. As I mentioned, asexual reproduction is also pretty common. You've got some catenulids on the left. You've got a planaria worm on the right. You can see how regeneration frequently works. In groups like the catenulid I showed you, stenostomum, asexual reproduction may be much more common than sexual reproduction. I know I've never seen those guys without finding multiple individuals in a chain. Okay. Traditionally, you divide Turbellaria into 14 orders. And I'm not going to hold you responsible for most of them. A lot of this turns on fine details of the structure of the gut, the reproductive system, and or things in the epidermis. So I'm not going to go over all of them. A few that you might see in lab next week include catenulids, which I've already mentioned. Those are the ones that reproduce asexually in chains. Very small aquatic flatworms are known as rhabdocoels. Rhabdocele means empty space like a rod. Rhabdos means a rod. And the seal here refers to the gut. The gut is basically an elongated sac. The gut doesn't branch a great deal, and these tend to be very small worms. Planaria worms and their kin are in a group called the Tricladida. Klados is Greek for a branch, as in cladistics. Tri is three. Tricladida means the gut has three main branches, one anterior and two posterior. I'll show you that in a bit. And then Polycladida, many branches in Greek. The gut looks very complex, and these tend to be the largest of the flatworms, the free-living ones anyway. These include the large marine forms like the Spanish dancer that I mentioned. So there's a catenulid up at the top right, by the way, that's a ciliate, paramecium. And this is considered the most basal group. And you can see what you're looking at that's kind of sweeping from upper left to lower right is a chain of at least 3 individuals, with some of those individuals beginning to divide into more individuals. So these will form chains of daughter individuals that break off and may eventually reproduce sexually, or may just give rise to new chains. So chain worms here. That's a rhabdocele. There's eggs inside the body. Those are those 7 large spheres. Up at the anterior end, the head is at the top, and a bit back of the head, you can see this somewhat faint, kind of translucent gray thing that looks like an X. That's actually the brain and the paired nerve cords extending anterior and posterior from the brain. And then the yellow thing in the middle, that's the gut. Hence the name rhabdocele, rod-shaped open space. This one's about 1 millimeter wide. That's not big enough that it starts needing to develop the branching guts that you would see in a larger flatworm. There's one that's part of a subgroup of the rhabdocoels, and this one happens to have a proboscis. The mouth's on the tip of that, and in this group, the proboscis is hooked and is used to catch prey. So pretty good diversity of flatworms. Some of them are scavengers. Some of them are predators. And then on the left, that's a typical planaria gut. You there? Okay. Somebody temporarily had the mic on. The mouth is actually down towards below the midpoint of that drawing. The mouth is on this tube called the pharynx that can be extended out of a pocket on the underside. And so, the mouth is not up at the head. The mouth is at the end of this retractable tube down in the midsection. And that mouth opens up into a gut that has 1 branch going towards the head and then 2 going around the sides and then back down towards the tail. And the way this one's been drawn, the 2 that go posterior wards towards the tail are a lot smaller than the branch that's going towards the head. Now, each of those 3 branches can further divide into smaller branches. And the upshot is that if you have that highly branched gut, there's no cell in the body that's very far from a gut branch, so they're all able to receive nutrition. And then polyclads that are even larger have even more complexly branched guts. And that's what that is on the right. That's a very complicated gut. That's an actual polyclad flatworm called Bodella ura. And you can actually see eye spots up at the upper right. Surrounded by that lighter zone is, in fact, the brain with a pair of nerve cords running back from it. And then you can also see all of those things that look kind of like fingers. That's gut branches. So polyclads have this very highly branched gut. Whereas planaria worms, you can see that pharynx about midway down, that thing that just looks kind of like a bar. That's the pharynx retracted into a sheath on the underside. And one of those branches goes up all the way to where it's right between the eyes. And the other two are the ones that extend on the left and right side backwards all the way towards the tail. And each one of these branches, has sub-branches on it. You can see how, lacy, how highly branched the gut looks. And again, that's so no part of the animal is very far from a space where it can pick up nutrients. That's a live planaria type worm that's actually protruding that pharynx. It's this whitish tube that's normally found in a sheath on the underside, but can be stuck out to feed. And when you look at planaria worms in cross-section, they look like this. What you're looking at in the center right there, that big round thing that looks like a big donut, that's the gut. And the empty space around it is that sheath or that sac. It's called the bursa. And that's another word you've seen before. Bursa means a purse or a pocket. It might look like a coelom, but it doesn't count as one because it's actually open to the outside. It's not an enclosed cavity surrounding the gut. That's the pocket that pharynx can be extended out of when needed or pulled back into. Other than that, you can see the body is pretty solid, except for some kind of irregularly shaped open spaces. That's the gut branches. Right. Planaria worms you've seen. With any luck, you'll get to see more this Tuesday, if all goes well. Occasionally, I'll get a student bring me in one of these because we have these in Arkansas, and they've extended, I believe, as far north as Connecticut. They're found in Britain now. They've gone pretty well worldwide, at least where you have fairly warm conditions. This is a land planarian called Bipalium cuense. Native to Malaysia, but it was cuense means from Kew, which is a neighborhood of South London that's famous for its huge botanical gardens. It's a world-renowned center for research on plants. And it's cool to visit because they have these tropical greenhouses that were built in the 19th century with these very ornate Victorian-style wrought iron frameworks holding up the panes of glass. Much more attractive than the useful but very functional type of greenhouses that you see today. And you walk in and they're full of rare orchids and palms and things like that. And apparently this thing turned up on a shipment of tropical plants that went from Malaysia to London. And in fact, you often find it in greenhouses. It tends to spread through the plant trade although in at least the warmer parts of the US, it can live outdoors. Um, the planaria worms that you saw, I assume, in 1441 were aquatic. They can't live very long out of water, but these can live anywhere it's warm and damp. And you can't mistake them for anything else. They're famous for that boomerang-shaped, crescent-shaped head. And they are predators. They're predators on earthworms. And when you put a Bipalium cuense in a petri dish with an earthworm, the result isn't pretty. There's the remains of the earthworm right there, and you can see there's several spots that look badly damaged. Bipalium can just extend that pharynx and wrap it around the earthworm and then secrete digestive enzymes that just turn the worm into soup while it's still alive and slurp up the resulting liquid. So, yeah, if you're an earthworm, stay away from these guys. If any of you ever see them, well, as far as I know, they're not considered that serious a threat to native earthworm populations. But those of you that work a lot with plants, especially in greenhouses, might encounter these at some point, and that's what they are. One that is potentially a risk to native earthworm populations is Arthrodendius triangulatus. They feed in the same way as Bipalium, sticking out their pharynx, wrapping it around an earthworm, and then digesting it and slurping it up like soup. This one's native to New Zealand, but it was introduced into Britain about 20-some years ago, and there is concern, or there was last I looked, that Arthrodendius might be a threat to the native earthworms of Britain. So there. And then finally, the polyclads are the large, ruffly ones that have that very complex branching gut. And many of these are actually quite attractive. So there's a North Atlantic species called Prosthocereus. And I like Eurylepta because it looks like a Cadbury cream egg that somebody left in the car for too long, right? You've got that that yellow yolk and the creamy white surrounding it with streaks of the chocolate around there. Yeah, not that I ever did that, but I imagine this is what it would look like if you left a Cadbury egg in the car. And that happens to be one from the Caribbean. And there are plenty of others there. All right, I've got 9:48. Go ahead and take 12 minutes. Come on, how do I get this thing to work? There we go. All right, I will stop recording and go ahead and get yourself some coffee or do what you need to do, and I'll kick it back in at 10. Dang, come on, where's the dock?